Welcome to the Voice of Dunn Books. I'm Adam Dunn, and today I am speaking with someone I've waited nearly a decade to meet. My guest is Loretta Napoleoni, a leading authority on terrorist financing, author of numerous books, including most recently The Islamist Phoenix, which will explain all about how ISIS gets its funding. But that's not how I came to know about her. I came to know about her through this book, Modern Jihad, published in 2007 in the United States. And as you can see, this is my dog-eared old copy. I use this as my research tool when I write my own books. This is going to explain to you exactly how terrorist groups fund their operations. Because whether a terrorist organization is clad in political rhetoric or religious robes, words can't buy bullets. Signora Napoleoni's work explains just how that is done. Welcome to the program. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
As I said, I first came to your work 9 years ago, and in your book, Modern Jihad, you made a claim that I'd like to revisit. You said then that the new economy of terror accounted for approximately 5% of global GDP. 9 years later, you think that's still the figure?
I think it's actually possibly even more than it was before 2001. We've seen a proliferation of armed organization, jihadist organization, slash criminal organization all over the world. So if we look at this critical mass, let's call it, and we look at their economy, I would say that possibly today we are around maybe 7%. We haven't done the calculation, but I would say that yes, he has grown. He's not shrinking.
And while the new economy of terror is growing, it's also taking new forms. And I wanted to ask about capital flows and the new developments in currencies employed by and for terrorism today. For instance, when, well, certainly around 9/11, nobody was thinking very much about virtual currencies such as Bitcoin. What has been the impact of the rise of virtual currency usage in terrorist financing?
Well, I would say that Bitcoins and all the various forms of money transfer which can take place through the internet electronically has been used to fund terrorist attack, to fund terrorist organization across the world. But I don't think that this is a significant portion of the funding. I mean, in other words, most of the money today which fund terrorist organizations across the world move in cash from A to B with couriers, for example. So the electronic side, it is important. Possibly it's used in the West, I would say, more than it is used in the Muslim world, but it's not so relevant. So after 9/11, because of the introduction of the Patriot Act and many legislation that controls the flows of money within the international banking system, the one we control, the terrorist financing has moved away from this network. So some money has started moving inside the Islamic banking system, which of course is not within our jurisdiction, but the bulk of the money is actually moved in cash. So a good example is the funding of the Islamic State in Syria before it actually became the Islamic State and before it became self-sufficient. The money came from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and the majority of the money came overland in suitcases. So this is the most common form of terrorist financing. And that's quite serious because we can't stop it. I mean, we have absolutely no control.
You raise an interesting point. You are describing in a sense, a two-tiered direction of capital flows. On the one hand, there is this completely illicit, cash-based, courier-transferred flow of terrorist financing, but you also mention the legitimate Islamic financial community. Question: are there links, intentional or inadvertent, between the legitimate Islamic financial system and terrorist operations?
Oh, I think there are, absolutely. I mean, I would say that there are intentional links. I mean, a country like Saudi Arabia officially funded jihadist organization from the beginning of the civil war in Syria. So we're not only talking about the Islamic State, which at the time was called the Islamic State of Iraq, but also we're talking about al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria. Now, of course, the reason why they were funding this organization, and some of them are still funding, of course, is because they were fighting against the regime of Assad. So a classic war by proxy. We knew that Saudi Arabia was funding a war by proxy using terrorist organization in Syria, and we didn't do anything about that. So I would say that although the Islamic banking system is out of our jurisdiction, politically speaking, there's a lot we could have done, and we didn't.
How about financially speaking? There are a number of organizations, agencies, services in place to monitor and even disrupt or intercept illicit capital flows. I'm thinking in terms of, let's say, organizations like Interpol, for example, or the Financial Action Task Force. These are interagency organizations with an international reach and a financial mandate, or rather a mandate for intercepting illicit capital flows. Are these powerless?
Well, I would say that they are powerless. What we must understand is this: that there is an international financial banking system, which is the Western system. So it's a system where you have the IMF, the World Bank, you have all these various organizations which monitor the illicit movement of funds within this system. Then there is another system. It's like another planet, let's say, where this organization in the Western system have no power whatsoever. And this is the Islamic banking system. The Islamic banking system has its own rules, has its own banks, and the two, of course, do business together. It's become increasingly difficult to do business together because of the restrictions that are imposed by our system, but nevertheless they do business together. But of course the jurisdiction of our monitoring organization doesn't go as far as this other system. So I would say yes, we are totally powerless. I mean, I think the only way to control what is happening inside the Islamic banking system is through political agreements.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because it's a segue into, if not financial monitoring, then actual intelligence, operational monitoring of fund flows. Towards your point, I do have a question. In 2007, as reported by Reuters, the Islamic Development Bank assembled and deployed a fund for the elimination of poverty in Africa. Reuters was able to report the story, but I wonder if you have since been able, or you or anyone else who is actively engaged in the monitoring of capital flows, were actually able to see where those funds were deployed, when, how, and whether or not the funds were diverted towards more nefarious ends, such as terror groups.
It's impossible to know exactly what has happened. The birth, in the 1950s, the birth of the Islamic banking system, I mean, the first international Islamic bank was set up in Saudi Arabia. The main task was development. So help Muslim worlds, they were less developed than others. In particular, we're talking about Africa, to develop. So if the money were sent for this task, this is in line with the idea to reduce poverty, of course. But generally, what we've seen before 9/11 has been a progressive diversion of funds away from the population towards armed organization, insurgency organizations. It's very easy, especially with charities, to divert funds, because how can you check exactly what is happening? Recently, just yesterday, there have been reports from Syria, for example, that the aid that finally has reached several Syrian villages which are under siege by the Assad regime, part of this aid has been diverted to armed groups operating in the area. But also, I would like to say that often in these countries, think about Somalia, think about even Sudan. These are countries been at war for a very long time. So the sustenance economy of this country has become very much illicit economy or terrorism. Think about kidnapping in Somalia, the piracy. So in desperate cases, as are these desperate cases of failed states or states that are very close to fail, illicit trade, smuggling, criminality becomes the only way to feed your own family.
Now, you have just described a failed or terrorist state. Is that state still considered a state actor? Let's put that in context at the moment. ISIS, the terror group now controlling territory in both Iraq and Syria, has, at least since 2014, been minting and circulating its own currency. Now, you've already alluded to a large part of terrorist operations being funded by cash. Usually people, when they think of cash, they will think of one of the primary currencies. ISIS actually upset the apple cart by simply inventing its own. How strong is that currency, and does that in effect make ISIS a state actor instead of a non-state terror group?
Well, I would say that the Islamic State is completely different from these other states. It's actually building a nation whereby a failed state is a state where the nation is disembodied. So the process of nationalism, the process of creation of a nation, of course, is a new phenomenon. We've never seen it before, but is seeking legitimacy by seeking the approval of the local population, and this approval is achieved through providing the population with all the services that a normal state actually provides, among which, of course, the use of a monetary means of exchange. Now, having said that, we have no proofs that the Islamic State is using only one currency within its territory. On the contrary, we have proofs that there are several currencies circulating inside the territory. So we know, for example, that the dollar is used for ransom. Kidnapping and ransom is either paid in dollars or is paid in euros. So this is unique. We have never seen it before. And it is a step, I think, forward in the so-called terrorism, also in the financing of terrorism, which we have not predicted, and also it's a step forward which we don't know how to deal with. I mean, how do we go about this? I haven't heard any politician or anybody suggesting how we're going to stop that.
You've described now the use of monetary means of exchanges, and I use that term plurally as per your description, within territories controlled by Islamic State. What about the use of hard assets, such as looted artifacts, such as oil from seized fields, such as human trafficking or arms dealing? To what extent does this also comprise a dimension of the new national economy of Islamic State?
This is a very interesting point, because we have read a lot about the smuggling of arts. We've read a lot about the sale of these arts, but we haven't seen any of those smuggled artifacts surface anywhere in the international arts market. What's happened to these artifacts? If we know that they are smuggled, if we know that they cross the border, how is it possible we don't know who in the world is buying them?
How large is the Islamic State economy, would you say?
The importance is not so much as how much money do you actually have, but how do you manage this money? I mean, that's the key issue, I think. So you can have all the money that you, like, in the case of the PLO, but then, if your administration is corrupted, if this money, instead of trickle down to the economy of the population, to the people, they are living in the occupied territories, but they are actually diverted to the various leaders of the PLO, then you're very poor.
We have been speaking with Loretta Napoleoni, world authority on terrorist financing, author of numerous books on the subject, including most recently The Islamist Phoenix. Thank you again for your time. We look forward to seeing you again.